Hi, my name is Gerhard Schwartner, and welcome to our webinar. It is my honor, pleasure, and privilege to introduce our guest, Spencer Wixom. He is the CEO of the Brooks Group, a world-leading sales training company. Welcome, Spencer.
Gerhard, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and good afternoon to you.
Well, a lot of people are a little bit worried about 2024. And what we are trying to do in this webinar today is to share cutting edge ideas on how to plan and win in 2024 with a dynamite sales strategy. Spencer, take it away.
Well, thank you, Gerhard. And it's exciting to be here with everybody today. Thank you all for joining. What I wanted to do as a part of this conversation is, first of all, look a little bit at where we are today in 2023, both from a buyer standpoint and from a sales organization or seller standpoint. Now, Gerhard and I want to have a conversation here. We're going to be having a dialogue between the two of us, but I want to invite you as well to join that dialogue and share your perspectives, thoughts, and questions as well. So if you do have those, please put those in, and we'll do our best to either get to those as part of the flow of conversation or when we get to the end. So let's dive right into that, Gerhard, should we, and talk about what we're seeing today. It's an interesting world for buyers right now, and I'm probably not sharing any statistics or information here that's anything new or revelatory to those on the call, but I think it's important for us to put all of them together into a coherent story. So first of all, we know that everyone in a position to be buying something today, whether on a B2B basis or a B2C basis, is just awash in advertisements, promotions, and branding from things that we could buy. 4,000 to 10,000 of these advertisements hitting our eyeballs every single day. We also know email, being the medium it is for communication, is absolutely saturated today. You think about it, there's about 4.4 billion or so email addresses out there in the world, and each of those addresses getting close to 100 emails a day. We're talking about 347 billion with a B emails being exchanged every single day. Now, most buyers, because of all of this outreach and push and momentum from advertisers and those trying to sell them something, are putting a freeze on that and really trying to make most of their decision through a digital self-learning channel. And so we have that resistance that we have to deal with. And so as a result, most of them are waiting for a good period of time during their buying journey to even reach out and engage with us as sellers. When they do engage with us, because they've looked at various solutions and they're trying to evaluate those solutions ahead against one another, and they've got a lot of uncertainty among a large buying group, a lot of complexity in their organizations, they are often, in fact, a large plurality of the time, unable to make a firm decision and go ahead, and that decision ultimately leads to no decision at all. So if you think about it, we've got some big issues here. We've got buyer access, trying to engage with them initially, trying to help them through a very complex learning and decision-making journey, and then always running that risk that at the end of the day, that decision-making journey is so complex and so difficult that they're ultimately not able to go forward. So we've got a lot of challenges as salespeople we've got to deal with today. Gerhard, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm just reminded we at the Sales 3.0 conference in Las Vegas, and Tiffany Bober from Salesforce.com surprised us with another amazing number, which is there are 9,500 sales technology tools out in the marketplace, and the opportunities that end in no decision, that percentage has not improved. That percentage has gone up because 10 years ago, when you had a lot fewer technologies, fewer no decision were reported, but also the ability to close forecasted deals was 50, it's about 50% right now. And 20 years ago, when there was no technology practically, the percentage was the same. So to me, there is a tension between technology and humanity. What we have done is we have to push the pedal to the metal with technology, and we have more technology doing things for us, and some of the technology is really great. However, the human ability to understand the world that we live in has declined, and the ability to make better decisions has declined as well.
You're absolutely right. And I think we see that right in the data, and we're going to share a lot more data today about that particular issue. But you make a really good point, right? I think the default strategy to deal with what we're seeing here is to use efficiency and technology to try to just bust through it, to push through it. And I think we're all coming to a pretty clear understanding that that's not necessarily the best. I'll say it more directly. That is not the best way to approach the situation. So I think the question we have to address today is, what is the best way for us as a sales organization with managers and individual sellers out there on the front lines trying to deal with this environment that we just painted here? What's the best thing for us to do, right? What's the best thing for us to prioritize going into 2024? Well, we've been asking that question quite a bit of individuals in our group, in our audience. And every time we do an interaction with a number of individuals, and we've had hundreds of them in the last few months, we ask that very simple question: what's the thing that is most challenging to you right now as a sales organization? What's interesting to us, Gerhard, is how these break down. So if you look at them and you keep in mind what you just said to us just a bit ago, right, of the human versus the technology, what are the biggest issues that we're kind of coming to a recollection of in 23 moving into 24? Well, number one, prospecting and discovery. I don't have buyer access. I'm not getting buyers to be responsive to me. So that's 28% of the responses that we've seen. Sales process. Either I don't have one or there isn't good adherence to one in my organization is another 21%. And then selling with value, being able to clearly articulate the value proposition, the return on effort, the return on investment that client or customer will secure. Not being able to do that effectively is another 20%. Now let me stop here. Let's stop here and have a bit of dialogue around that. That is 70% of individuals who responded to us who are in sales leadership positions, sales executive positions, saying these are the challenges that we have.
Well, I think that when you look at, reframe the question and say, how can I be more successful in facing those challenges? And to me, the simple way to explain it is the right mindset, the right skill set, and the right tool set.
Yeah.
Now, the mindset is all about how do you think about those top three challenges: prospecting, sales process, and selling with value. I think the prospecting is a skill set, in my opinion, and a lot of people's skills are atrophied, not because there's not enough training, because technology actually gives people a false sense of confidence that things will happen. But people tend to forget, if you don't make the calls and make the dials and reach out, your funnel is going to shrink automatically. The second one, the sales process, in my opinion, is that companies that I've studied that are highly successful, they put some rigor in the system. They follow a process like what you teach at the Brooks Group. You have a winning process that salespeople stick to, and if you stick to it, you're gonna get the results. And the third is to me, we are in a conversation economy. And when you analyze the sales conversations, and there are plenty of technology tools that give you a transcript like Gong of sales conversations, and sales managers can analyze that. And when you look at that, there are two things that stick out to me. One is clarity, and the other one is value.
Mhm.
Salespeople are not clear enough in articulating the real issue that the customer has raised. So they're unable to completely understand the customer's problem or situation. And when it comes to articulating the value, there is always a little bit of a disconnect where they don't hit the target, where they express the value in terms of product benefits or company prestige, or the prestige of the logo, but they need to speak to the customer situation and express the value in terms that the customer can understand and relate to.
Absolutely. And we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into that, because I think that's a really important part. But I think where we're coming together here is, and this is what leaders are telling us, is that human conversational process element is really critical to get right today. And if you look at the other ones that we haven't dealt with yet, and we will talk about these because I think they're important, dealing with adversity and a lack of motivation among salespeople, that's 17%. And then just that tactical closing technique, 9%, and then hiring and retaining sales talent at 5%. And we'll talk a little bit about the closing piece. I think what's really important to consider on that closing piece, that 9%, so many of these other things that are bigger representations here, the process, the prospecting and discovery, the selling with value, support that closing element. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but I think it's important, if you're having a difficulty with uncertainty and slippage in your closing, to think about looking forward in your process and what may be broken earlier on that we need to address to support that piece. Now, you said something earlier that I think is really important as a way of framing this. And let's take a moment to frame this situation in how we address it. And I think there's 3 parts to it. So first of all, we need to define the sales process. We need to make sure it's simple, they're able to follow it. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways in which we do that here in a minute. But that definition of a sales process that can be consistently and clearly adhered to is really important right now. Secondly, we need to refine the skill set that underpins that process. The process is what you do, how you do it, the quality by which you do it is equally important. And we're going to highlight a couple of points in the process that we're seeing organizations need to sharpen tactical skills in order to succeed. And then third, and as you were saying, Gerhard, we need to strengthen the mindset. Even if we have a great process and we think people understand how to execute that process with a skill set, if they don't have that healthy mindset to motivate them, to encourage them to do it, we are not going to be as effective as we would like to be.
Well, there is no difference in outcomes between a salesperson who has a great skill set, who is very experienced, but has a poor mindset, and the salesperson that is new, that has a great mindset, but has no skill set. We need to have programs in every organization that addresses the mindset and the skill set challenge on an ongoing basis. This is a race without a finish line.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's first start talking about the process piece. And to do that, I think what would be most effective for us right now is to reach out to the audience that's joined us today. And we'd really appreciate your thoughts here. We're going to do a couple of quick polls on process. The first one you can see is just a quick binary. Does your company have a defined sales process? Yes or no? We'd be curious to see of our audience today what your answers are to that question. As soon as we do that one, we'll introduce, we got a couple of seconds to just do a quick yes, no answer there. We'll then move on to our next question that's going to take us a click deeper here on process.
Well, I see the answers coming in, and right now they're changing with every new response, but they're sort of settling at 72% to 28%, 73%, 27% say no. So I think that's what you want to get at, how many people do not have a defined sales process. Here's the final.
So 73% yes, 27% no. So a lot more say yes, we have defined a process. That 27% who don't have the defined process, it's a good time to consider a simple, effective way to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now can we go to the second question here quickly? Because I think that's an important one as we're having our discussion here to click down on. If you have that sales process established, what percent of the time do your sellers follow that sales process consistently or effectively? You follow it almost all the time? Because what we're trying to measure here is adherence. Let's see how closely or well we adhere to that process that we've defined. So we'll give you just a second to answer this question.
Well, that's going to be interesting. My guess is that the highest percentages that follow most of the time. But I think we also have a few responses that they're not as rigorous as they want to be.
Mm-hmm. So 41% on most of the time, but 31% occasionally, and only 8% here follow it almost all of the time. So Gerhard, there's two things I'd like to explore together here really quickly. Thank you everyone for participating in this. I think the good news is there's only 3% who follow it rarely or never. So most of us are kind of in that mushy middle around adherence to our defined sales process. Gerhard, let's tackle a couple of ideas here as it relates to that as we talk about process. Number one, why do we think that adherence isn't as high as we would like it to be? Where are we struggling? I've got a couple of ideas on that, but I'd love to get your ideas first.
Well, I think that salespeople have short-term memory. And when they go through a situation where they get turned down and don't make the sale, then they don't want to blame it themselves. They don't want to accept responsibility, and they blame the process, or they blame their company, or they blame the product, or they blame the customer, but not themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I think when I think about it, number one, it's that process may not be as simple, clear, or intuitive enough for them to really understand and be able to recall in the moment. I think one of the most important things in sales, as I've often taught and reinforced in organizations I've worked with, when I've taught sales in different places, is you need to have the acumen to react in the moment. Sales is an uncertain, changing, human, messy, some people would call it like a wicked learning environment, right? What the rules that you think you know, you're never quite sure of the rules, and the ones you think you know are constantly changing. And so having a good intuition in the moment as to where you are and having the acumen to be able to react appropriately is important. And I think the second piece of that is sometimes sellers think they're following the process, but they're not following the process. So they're not consciously choosing to deviate from an established process. They just don't realize they lack the acumen to follow the process effectively. And it's interesting at the Brooks Group, that's the thing we've been measuring for some time. So we have a tool we call the Selling Skills Index. And it's a really elegant tool for testing the acumen, the situational acumen of sellers across an intuitive sales process. So the process that we use for selling, that we promote for selling, is what we call IMPACT, is the acronym: investigate, meet, probe, apply, convince, and tie it up. What I love about this is it's pretty intuitive. The language is simple. It's a pretty clear process to understand and to follow. But in each of these steps of the process, there's a situation or situations where you need to make real-time decisions or have good acumen to choose to do the right things or prioritize the right things in that moment. And what's fascinating to me, we've done the Selling Skills Index with thousands of sellers every year for a number of years, and we like to take an overall look at how good sellers are at that index. And you can see in the data here on the slide our most recent snapshot of that. Now, let me orient you to the numbers here. That 50, 49, 47, that is an index score of the total population that can answer correctly, is fully confident to do the right thing in that moment. So only about 50% of sellers know how to execute, investigate correctly. The ones that I have circled there are the ones we really should pay attention to, right? That probe, that critical questioning. You see a dip there, and then you see a dip in the tie it up. I don't know how to keep that deal from slipping at the last minute. It appeared we're pretty good at presenting our solution, applying our solution to the customers' issues that we've uncovered. We're pretty good at negotiating and convincing them, but you can kind of see our peaks and our valleys across this process. Overall, however, there is a lot of improvement room in any organization for better situational acumen at each stage of the sales process.
Can I say something?
Please, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The probe, it reminds me of a quote by Werner Heisenberg, who was a professor of physics, and he said, "Nature does not reveal its secrets. It only responds to our method of questioning." And the same thing applies to sales. Customers don't reveal their secrets. They only reply to the method of questioning of a skilled salesperson. So if you don't have the probing skills, and if you cannot apply it in a tricky situation and ask the right question and get the customer to think differently about what they're thinking in order to persuade them and influence them, you don't have a chance to earn that sale.
Now, Gerhard, you're talking about, is that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle?
Right.
Correct? Do I have that accurate? And it's interesting,
Yeah.
right? Because you're saying like like when we measure something, when we observe something, we adjust it in some way, right?
Right.
And
Right.
it's interesting because Dr. Dover, who's a good friend of mine, and I think I talk about him because I think his most recent book is so critical and timely right now.
Yeah.
I talk about him in about every one of these sessions that I do, but he's talked a lot about how our activity as salespeople has conditioned our buyers or conditioned our market into resistance. And I think that's an important thing for us all to consider, particularly in prospecting. But I think the point you're making as well is by following an effective process and having the acumen to execute these moments correctly, we condition them to better behavior as well. So we leave neutral ground, right? Everything we do as part of a process as salespeople cannot be neutral to the customer and to the market. It is either going to move them or condition them toward positive action, or it's going to move them or condition them toward negative or resisting action.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's why it's like we can't afford to not be disciplined in this area.
Right. And there's another way to influence the customer, two ways. One is you tell a good story that is sort of representative of their situation on how you have helped another customer solve a similar problem. But you can reverse that and you can ask the customer to tell you a story about their situation and how they have resolved a similar challenge in the past. So you have more information on how to sell them.
No, it's a great point. And it's connecting with that customer effectively as part of this process. I want to move on to skills because I think skills are an important part of this and make sure we as well have some time to talk about mindset. But I do want to just make one closing argument in a sense for process and just sum up a little bit of what we've been talking about. Number one, it's exciting to see that a lot of organizations, particularly in this webinar, have a process that they've defined. What I would challenge everyone, particularly those who don't have a well-defined process, it's important to adopt that process and define it. But it's also critically important to, number one, evaluate, is our process clear, simple, intuitive, something that sellers can tactically take and apply. If it's too complex, if it's not clearly defined or intuitive, sellers are going to struggle, and they're going to do one of two things. They're going to trip over their own feet trying to follow it, or they're going to throw it away and do their own thing. And that lack of adherence to the process, you are going to feel in the reaction from your customers and in the success of your business. So that's the first part. The second part is, just because you have a process and because you've rolled out this process does not mean your sellers have the acumen to execute it effectively. And it's really important to test for that acumen, evaluate that acumen, so that you know how you can make adherence and execution better.
By the way, I'm monitoring some of the questions that we are getting, and one of the questions.
Can we take a question here? That'd be good.
Yeah, no, one of the question was the title of the book. Dr. Howard Dover's book is called The Sales Innovation Paradox, and
That's right.
fascinating read, so I highly recommend it.
For sure. Great. Any other questions, Gerhard, or should we move on to skills?
Move on to skill.
Okay. So let's jump into refining the skill set. We've established the process. We are confident that we have adherence to the process and an acumen in executing the process. But let's go a click deeper into some of these skills and talk about what's really needed to do them well. First thing we want to tackle, which was that biggest issue earlier on that we talked about, is how do we get buyer access? How do we connect with buyers? Let me share with you a little bit of research that we've done recently. We wrote a white paper on prospecting that you can get on our website to give you more detail into this, these findings that I'm going to share here. It's got a lot of data behind it, but I wanted to summarize it into a key point here on this slide. Number one, we looked at what method of outreach do buyers prefer for contact with a salesperson. Now, I think a lot of people today are hunting for that new and kind channel to engage with buyers. They feel like, and we talked about this, yes, there are some channels that are saturated, but at the end of the day, buyers still want to connect via email, phone call, text message. Those are their primary methods. That's what they like to engage around. Here's the rub, here's the thing. It's not about the channel. Those channels can be very effective when the message that builds trust and value resonates with that buyer. You have to think about what makes them certain to want to respond, what makes them certain that the message I'm sending to them is a relevant, compelling, beneficial message for them. And there's a few things to keep in mind here. Number one, do they have previous experience with your brand or with your organization? Do they know you in some way? Do they have some reason to trust you or be interested in what you have to say? If they don't, just directly trying to contact them is going to get an infinite amount of resistance. Number two, were they referred to you or connected to you by some trusted source? They need to trust somebody in that chain of communication to be open to having a conversation with you. And number three, this is kind of where the bullet meets the bullet. You and your company has self-identified a need for the seller's product or service, meaning that buyer has said, okay, this is something I need, this is something I'm actively looking for, and you just happen to connect with them at that point in time. Now, that's a numbers game. That's putting it out there, just hoping that you get the right people at the right time. It does, though, happen if you are going after your ideal customer profile with a very compelling message that is relevant and timely for them.
I got a comment from the audience. It's not only your sales team's process acumen. Test your frontline sales management. Leadership in the moment is the key.
It's a really good point, right? How well do our managers understand the process? How well our managers can execute the process? Because if the managers can't, how are they going to coach and reinforce that process to the sellers below them?
Exactly. There's an old saying that salespeople respect what their manager expects and inspects.
No, absolutely. So
So
Gerhard, sorry, go ahead.
Personal question, Spencer. When it comes to communicating with your clients, what is your preferred channel? Email, phone call, or text message? And then the follow-up question would be, how do you know what your clients want?
Well, so my preferred, when you're talking about our organization, our preferred method is basically whichever of these three will get a response, but we also recognize that we need to have something compelling, timely, beneficial, interesting to provide to them. I don't want to just reach out for the sake of reaching out. And I also
Right.
want to build connections and build an appreciation and an understanding for our brands, for the ideas that we have prior to doing that reach out. Again, if they haven't had any exposure to you, the quality of what you have to offer to the market, have been told by somebody else or seen from somebody else, some kind of a testimonial around your value, there's not going to be the trust there. There's not going to be the interest there. So we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort just trying to promote good ideas, good reference to individuals in advance and around outreach that we do.
I think there's also an important distinction that we need to make between pitching and engaging. And as an example, when you don't know the other person well, it may be presumptuous to pitch, but it may be advantageous to engage by saying, here is some information. We have developed a new ebook. Would you be interested in taking a look? And maybe if you have questions, we can set up an appointment instead of just attaching an ebook to an email.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. Bill Brooks used to say many years ago, buyers pay attention to sellers who have something important to say. Now there's a couple of words in that statement that are critical to recognize. Buyers pay attention. He didn't say buyers respond. There's a difference between paying attention and responding. And here's the thing, I think the mistake that we make in our prospecting is we are myopically focused on trying to get a response. Why? Because a response is good for us. Well, the buyer is not going to always do activity that is best for us. They may do activity that is good for them, that may obliquely be good for us at some point that's not of our determination. What we have to do, I think where we have to prioritize and focus initially in our outreach, in our prospecting, is can I get them to pay attention to something? And we know they pay attention to things that are important to them, that are relevant to them, that are connected to something that they're trying to do. And if we can get them to pay attention across a couple of instances, we are building that trust and that previous experience that's necessary for them to respond to outreach in the traditional channels.
Well, here's a very nice comment from Mike Spencer. Your team builds strong bonds and builds trust by listening, getting to know us first. Congratulations.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mike. And Gerhard, perhaps it's good this is probably a good time for us to move on to that. Let's talk about listening. Let's talk about questioning, because I think that's the step after prospecting. We talked earlier about seeing an acumen lack in sellers around probing, around discovery. And I think a lot of that has to do with the depth of probing or discovery that we really need to be doing today to understand the situation sellers are in.
Yeah.
Now, a good way to understand this, and we like to use the tree and the roots analogy. Oftentimes, as sellers, we're searching for the trees in the forest. And by trees in the forest, I mean a buyer who has a need to buy the thing we have to sell. But here's an important statement to remember. Nobody ever needed to buy something unless they wanted to do something. So the question is not, what do they need to buy? The question is, what is it that they want to do? What are they seeking? What are they trying to accomplish? Because the connection to emotion, which is at the core of what everyone does, whether they're a consumer, whether they're a business to business buyer, it is all driven emotionally. And the key to that emotion is, what are you seeking? What are you trying to do? And as sellers, we need to, in our discovery, in our listening, we call it 3D questioning, but we need to dig deep enough to understand the wants and the whys below the needs.
I like that tree analogy, because that is, it's typical of human nature. Everybody wants to admire the tree and look at what's above ground, but in order to understand the tree, you're going to look below. And when you ask questions just about the needs, then you miss 2/3 of the information that you really need in order to sell well. And to me, the deepest level is the why. Somebody once said, the bigger the why, the bigger the try, the easier the how. And when you understand the why, what drives people, then you have the key to the sale.
No, it's absolutely right. And I think going into 2024, organizations need to think, do our people have the acumen to not only identify needs, but explore through open-ended questioning, through effective dialogue, wants and whys, and really get at the core understanding. It's going to be very difficult for you to position a solution that will engage a buyer, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, if you don't understand those critical elements. If you're just going through the forest looking for trees to chop, if you don't understand what's holding those trees up in the first place, right? How those trees are rooted, your win rate is going to be what we talked about earlier, Gerhard, right? You're going to see those win weights slip down, and you're going to see,
right,
that's where you're going to see those late stage closing problems, is because you haven't dug deep and understood the roots of the tree.
Absolutely.
So that's the questioning. We need to be training. We need to be establishing individuals' ability to do that. Let's talk about presenting the value after. And again, remember, this was, when you think about that wheel that we showed at the first, we've talked about prospecting. These are 70% of what organizations are struggling with. We've talked about the prospecting, talked about the process adherence, the questioning and the discovery. And now we're talking about the delivery of value as part of that conversation. And a lot of that comes from uncovering what it is that they want to do. What are their goals? What are their objectives? What are they trying to achieve in their business? And then can we present the benefit of our solution to support those goals as being, it's a very basic equation, as being greater than the perceived price or the perceived emotional cost of taking the action, of making the change, of doing something different, of investing with us.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that value conversation has two components. One is your ability to articulate that value so that the customer understands it. But there is something hidden in the communication between you and the buyer, which is the character and the body language. Are you a person of value? And a person of value is the trusted advisor. So if you position yourself in terms of the, in terms of the trusted advisor, you have a much higher chance of closing the sale, because without trust, there is no sale.
No, you're absolutely right. And if you notice there in the denominator of the equation, it talks about the perceived price or the perceived emotional cost, right? And the value that will offset that perceived price or perceived emotional cost. And think about the emotional cost is a lot about the risk. How much am I putting on the line to invest in what you're suggesting to me? And when I see you as an advisor, as somebody who will hold my hand and guide me through not only the decision-making journey and the transaction, but the delivery of a solution to a positive outcome in my business, when I see that, when I can feel that tangibly because I'm working with a human being who I trust to do that with me, that perceived emotional cost goes down. And as that denominator shrinks, the ratio between that denominator and the numerator, which is the benefit, gets greater.
I think that the title is understanding value, but what we really mean is to translate that into a value conversation. And to me, a value conversation is something that's enlightening. Where Dr. Norman Vincent Peale once said the definition of a good sale is when the buyer and the seller walk the road of agreement together.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're 2 steps ahead of the buyer, you lose the buyer. If the buyer is faster and 2 steps ahead of you, you lose the buyer as well. So the value conversation is really one where you stay in sync with the buyer every step of the way. So when the buyer talks about the emotional cost, you want to respond with empathy, but also remind the buyer of what the value is that they're receiving in exchange.
No, you're absolutely right. And that reminds me of something that Bill Brooks used to teach back in the day, which was when you think about walking this process with the customer, right? Don't skip the steps. Make sure you're, supporting that customer in each of the steps, right? Make sure you're completing each of the steps with that customer as you move forward, and make sure you and the customer, like you were saying, Gerhard, are in the same step at the same time. Don't get too far ahead. Don't assume you have substantiated the value if you are not getting confirmation from that customer that you have substantiated the value. And this is where it comes down to dialogue and communication and understanding. Because if you don't have that understanding, you can't just assume they get it and they're fully on board. Then we get the surprise at the last minute when the deal doesn't come through, and we wonder, well, what can we do at this point? Well, it's all going back to, did we dig deep enough to understand the roots of the tree? And then did we substantiate the value well above and beyond a perceived price and a perceived emotional cost?
We just got a quick comment. I want to share that with you. Understanding the value and being able to articulate is one of the hardest things to coach people without the proper probing. You must be at the same spot in the process as your customer. And I think that's the reason why you have developed that Brooks training program that guides salespeople so they can understand it and become better in achieve a higher situational awareness, but also increase their comfort level in having a conversation that's value based.
You're absolutely right. And Gerhard, I want to restate something. You and I were at dinner a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about something, and I want to restate that because I think it's what I shared at that dinner, and I think it's core to what we're trying to help organizations at the Brooks Group do. And it goes along with the comment that was just made here, which is, to me, you divide up sales into 2 things: work, in my estimation, work and homework. And organizations and coaches and managers have a pretty easy time getting sellers to do work. You have a much harder time getting sellers to do and to love homework. And what we're talking about here in this value is the homework part of sales. It's taking that extra time to really calculate, think critically about the customer's business, synthesize all of the information that they've shared with you in discovery, and put together a strong, compelling argument for the value above the perceived cost. And what your goal ultimately is as an organization is to train, motivate, inspire, coach, support your sellers in doing and loving the homework. And that's what we're all about at the Brooks Group in our training, in our reinforcement, is how do we get sellers to know how to and love doing the necessary homework to get the deals done. today. And you've got to, because we're in an environment today where organizations are not flush with cash that they have pressure to spend, which we were in that position 5, 7, 10 years ago. We are not in that position today. Organizations are looking at their money, their capital, and they're having to make really difficult decisions on where they invest that capital. And they're going to evaluate each and every avenue for that capital based on this equation here.
And part of the homework is to practice for the better conversation. And when you look at all the winners in tennis or in golf or in football, the winners are always practice more. They out-practice their competition.
Practice is what gets you stronger. It strengthens the muscles and the acumen. And there are ways to baseline measure the acumen of doing this and measure that acumen later to measure that improvement. That's an offer I'm going to talk about at the end of this conversation, how we can help organizations evaluate that. And it goes back to that selling skills index that I talked about earlier. In the interest of time, I want to move through a couple of other things if we can. One thing here is just what's left to do here is after we have done good discovery, after we have substantiated the value, the solution, we need to still think about, and we talked about this just a bit ago, guiding that buyer through the rest of that decision-making process. And at the end of the day, having the confidence and the capability to ask for the business. And if you've made the case effectively, if you know you have that buyer on board with the solution you've done your homework to establish, you should have all the confidence in the world in asking for that business.
Yeah, those are numbers by Gartner Group that really gives you pause to think. Selling is not easy, but there is a quote by General Suvorov. He was a general in the Russian army, and he wrote a book called Train Hard to Fight Easy.
Makes sense.
And selling can be really easy if you train hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it becomes easier. Like what does it say? Like, oh, I'm gonna butcher the quote, but it's like those who kind of practice and train for some reason become luckier than those who don't. I'm not articulating it correctly, but that's the idea, right? You make your own luck through practice and skill building and strengthening. So if somebody here on the call knows the actual quote, please put that in there for me because I'd love to be reminded of it. Let's take a few minutes and talk about mindset, because I think this is critically important. As we were saying, this underpins a lot of the ultimate ability to succeed in 23 going into 24 is, do you have the right mindset? I'm going to share with you a little bit of information that we've seen as far as the shifting mindset and some of the problems that we're seeing associated with that, but also some of the solutions if we just recognize them. So first of all, let's talk about change in behavior and motivation among salespeople. As I said, we have a population of thousands of salespeople that we evaluate every single year. And one of the things that's been interesting to us recently is going back and looking at behaviors and motivations of salespeople across the last 5 or so years as we've gone through COVID and we've come into a new economic environment. Here's a couple of things that we're seeing in summary. When you think about behavior, and we're talking about the DISC framework for behavior and communication here. So dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. There are 2 of those that we have seen shift. We've seen influence, the ability to influence, or the focus or the proclivity to influence, go down 4%. And we've seen compliance, which is analysis, thoroughness in detail, go up 4%. Now let's take that one for just a second. What I think is interesting there in those shifts, and they are statistically significant shifts across a very large population. Part of that I think is COVID, the lockdown being more isolated from customers. Part of that I think is generational, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I think we're moving into a generation that is more digitally and analytics minded and less influence and performance minded. And that's an issue. We've got to be able to develop that, strengthen that muscle for them. Let's talk about motivation really quickly. We measure motivation across 6 different categories, and it's important to look at these when you understand what drives your team. Individualistic motivation, meaning I'm in it for my own achievement, my own recognition and accolades, down 7%. Utilitarian motivation, meaning I'm searching for an ROI on what I do, a return on effort, a return on my investment, down 5%. Aesthetic motivation, I'm interested in collaboration and harmony and unity, up 4%. Now, I think COVID broke us a little bit on individualism, right? But I think this is a generational thing as well, and we'll talk about that. But there is a fundamental change in the way salespeople see their own motivation and what motivates them. And if organizations lag behind understanding this and continue to push motivational models that don't align to these changes, you're going to have a hard time getting your people to give that extra effort at work.
Those are great points, Spencer. And I'm glad you keep your finger on the pulse on those behavioral changes. I'm really concerned about the influence going down. And the question is, how do you counteract that? What's the best solution?
Well, I think, Gerhard, I think it's what we said before. It's practice. It's putting people in situations where those muscles need to be stronger. We can't allow our salespeople to hide behind a digital strategy. It's pick up the phone, have phone calls, get out there, engage with people, stand at a booth in a trade show, right? It's the old, like, get comfortable being close to people, because you influence people when you are close to them in proximity, and you are closer to somebody in a Zoom call or a phone call than you are in a text message or an email. Get as close to your buyers as you possibly can to practice that level of communication. I mean, here's the interesting thing, and let's talk about this really quickly, because I think there's some strengths and there's some pitfalls involved in this. We are going through a massive generational shift in sales right now. We're already in it, and it's going to continue for the next 5 to 7 years or so. And what's interesting about generational shifts is the following generation tends to follow some very opposite inclinations of the previous generation. So for example, individualistic and innovators, those are your silent generation, Gen X and Gen Z. Your collaborative and creative generations are your boomers and your millennials. And it tends to go in this kind of a wave. Where are we right now? Well, if you look at the data, we still have a lot of boomers. They're about 20% of our workforce right now. But they are very quickly retiring. Gen X is about 35% of the workforce, millennials 40% of the workforce, and Gen Z 5% of the workforce. So they're just coming into it right now. Now, as those boomers retire, the millennials are going to represent, millennials and Gen Z are going to represent a bigger component of it. Where we are right now is on that collaborative, creative interest in millennials. And that's why we're seeing those shifts in the data that I talked about earlier. That's why we're seeing the rise in the aesthetic motivation and the reduction in the individualistic and utilitarian motivation, because millennials are becoming a bigger part of our survey population. At least that's my theory for the case. And so we have to think as sales organizations, number one, how do we engage these millennials who are at that prime selling and work age? And then how do we start to, over time, get ready for Gen Z that's going to be a bigger part of our individual contributor population as well. And at some point, we're going to have a pretty like equilibrium between those two generations who think very different from one another.
I just want to give you a 5-minute warning and read a question that I think we need to address. Can
let's
talk
do
more
it.
about the aesthetic motivation and how you influence those individuals? Good question.
It is a very good question. No, those individuals are looking for harmony. They're looking for balance. So you'll notice this on LinkedIn, right? You see much fewer posts on LinkedIn these days of the individual seller holding the crystal obelisk, or the individual seller promoting, the amount of performance against target that he or she hit. And you're seeing much more sellers saying, I'm able to be a very productive and effective salesperson and spend some time on the beach and go mountain biking and go skiing and have a life with a wife or a husband and a family or a spouse or a partner or whatnot. They are looking for balance and harmony in their life. Now, you can get a lot out of those individuals. You can really engage those individuals when you have an awareness of what it is that they want, and that is what they're looking for. But I would go back to the most important thing before you make any bold actions in your organization is understand how your people are motivated. If you can't answer that question, you need to do the assessing and the research to understand that. And that is something we at the Brooks Group can help you to do. We can help you to understand at a very deep individual level, at a team level, and at an organizational level, what your motivational profile looks like.
Perfect, very helpful answer is the response. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. I'm just going to hit one more thing. Fortunately, we're a little less time, but I just want to plant this in everybody's minds as we close up things here. Number one, we are seeing a shift in personal selling skill capabilities, skills like self-management, resiliency, self-starting ability, problem solving. You can see all of them there. Since COVID, we have seen a consistent reduction in those skills. Now, why this is concerning? It's because sellers are atrophying in their capability, which means we've got to train harder, we've got to coach harder, we've got to reinforce more, focus more of our attention and our resources on building these skills back up. We measure them every single year. We measure them with large populations, and that's what we're seeing. The one skill that we are seeing go up is empathy. That's the shining positive light here. We think we have a sales population today that is more virtuous, team-oriented, excited to work as part of an organization when engaged properly, but they're less capable. We've got to build those skills up. Now, some of this as well comes from we're moving out very experienced, tenured sellers. We're bringing in people who don't have as much life experience, who haven't developed these skills as fully, and we need to recognize that, which means it is continuing to invest in training and coaching to support them. Sorry I had to run through that quickly. Would love to have more conversation with those who are interested in these particular findings because we think they're very important and we can assess them in organizations. Gerhard, let's talk about what let's kind of summarize everything that we've talked about here. Number one, we talked about adopting a sales process that is clear, simple, easy to follow, and that can be well adhered to, and strengthening the acumen around that process. We at the Brooks Group can help with that by establishing a process, testing that acumen, and building that acumen. We need to train and coach around a couple of things in particular: prospecting, discovery, value creation, leading to closing. You need to strengthen those skills. Training is a good way of doing it, plus some coaching and some follow-on practice and support. We at the Brooks Group can help you to do that. But lastly, and very important in this day and age, we need to better understand the seller's mindset. We need to understand their communication and behavioral profile. It's critically important to understand how they are motivated and to get a sense for their mental clarity, their personal skill levels, so that we know what we have, what we're dealing with, and we can find customized ways to strengthen. Again, we have some capability to help with that. And more generally, we have some content around Guide to an Effective Sales Process, which is a great launching point as you're thinking about your 2024 strategy.
Well, I want to backtrack to the reason why salespeople are in business. They're in business to help customers solve problems. What you showed in 2 slides ago was really alarming to me, where you shared that across your population of salespeople that you've surveyed, that their problem-solving skills has gone down by 7%.
Yeah.
And I know as a fact that the complexity of the world and the number of problems are increasing steadily. So if we have problems going up, I see more opportunities for trained salespeople to make a killing, to make a better living, and for companies get greater market share. And companies that ignore the fact that salespeople are not skilled enough to solve problems, they're losing market share and they're losing opportunities galore. So I think that you are part of the solution. The Brooks Group is part of the solution. And based on the feedback we are getting here, excellent session by Shannon. Thank you so much for your strongly suggest using Brooks if you want to help solve your customer problems by Mike Johnson. Thank you, Mike.
But
Right.
Gerhard, you're absolutely right in your assessment there. I apologize. I had to run quickly through those personal skills because they are critically important. And the way we assess them is that's not a salesperson's personal view. That's not a manager's view. That is measuring actual capability. That is, do sellers think clearly? Do they have strong capability to do those things? And we're seeing that atrophy, and we need to strengthen it. That's going to give greater confidence and capability to sellers in dealing with complicated situations that are omnipresent in the market right now.
Right. Here's the final question, and I really love that. Do you see companies or industries as a whole phase out of cold calling? It's a funny question. Cold calling doesn't seem to be the preferred contact method today that receives a high response rate. And I know my answer, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, my answer is, cold calling, it all depends on like what temperature we're talking about with cold here. Calling needs to be part of a connecting strategy with individuals. I think you can use calling as part of a strategy to connect with customers and organizations. But again, focusing on that tactic of calling without seeding those opportunities with an understanding of you, with a confidence in you, with almost a certainty that you are somebody they want to talk to, yes, you will have a very low response rate, if any response rate at all. It's not the act of calling itself. It's everything you do around and through the act of calling that makes the difference as to whether that is an effective thing to do or not.
To me, cold calling is a mindset and a skill set, and that can be learned, and you can be much more effective, because I see a lot of people relying on technology and think that they can push a button and then customers will come to them and throw money at them. That's an illusion. There is nothing that can replace that funnel expansion that you get from cold calling with combined with good skills and good technology like Connect and Sell.
No, it's all about the quality of the message, the quality of the engagement, the strength we have as individuals, the mindset that those individuals have to be able to adapt and react in the moment effectively.
And the quality of the conversation. So thank you, Spencer, for a great conversation that I encourage you to continue. Scan those QR codes, reach out to the Brooks Group, and you are going to have a phenomenal 2024.
Appreciate it, Gerhard. It's such a great opportunity to be with you, have this conversation, and thank you to everybody who's joined us. It's been wonderful. We'd love to keep a conversation going if you're interested.
Thanks, everybody.